So we will call the May 11th Budget Committee to order. And do we have any committee business that we need to work on right now?
Nothing off the top, nope.
Do we have minutes to approve?
I do believe you have minutes, yes. You delayed the minutes that you'd received the last time,
So that would have been
Right.
for the 4th, right?
yes. And then you have received Tuesday the 9th as well. But
Okay.
you can decide what you're comfortable approving at this point.
Okay. Again, I didn't look at the 9th. If anybody else did it, we should delay that for another day, I suppose. But the 4th, we should probably look at approving. So are there any, do you have a motion to approve the May 4th?
I move we approve May 4th minutes as read and printed.
Second.
Second. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? All right, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right. Motion carried. Okay, so we have Alex and Steve here today. Welcome.
Yay!
And we'll just go right into it. I guess it's your show, so.
Okay. All right, well, Chair Weber, members of the committee, it's an honor to be with you this morning, or this afternoon, 2 p.m., 2 hours in. I need some more coffee.
This day.
All right, so we're going to brief you this afternoon just on the state of affairs. We're going to touch on federal, and we're going to touch on state. There's a common thread of drama associated with both at both levels of governance. Above this level, we have a high stakes activity happening. Thank God for local government. We keep the lights on and we keep the garbage off the street. All right, so we're going to specifically just kind of give you a sense of where we are. We don't have specifics yet. Next Wednesday is the next revenue forecast coming from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. So this will be kind of the dropping of the hanky for the final push for getting the next biennial budget together. So this is the official numbers that the Legislative Joint Ways and Means Committee will lock into place and will help everyone understand what the specific allocations are. And for the categorical specifics, things like the Community Corrections Act, for instance, these are critical, right? These are the formula funds. So we're going to talk today about what we know and what we can kind of share with you. So the first place to start really is the last revenue forecast that we got. So this was released on March 1. Specifically, OEA at that point were updating numbers from the fall of 2022. In fall of 2022, they were projecting a mild recession in the early part of this upcoming biennium specifically. So they're looking at a whole range of economic indicators, and they're looking at maybe specific market reactions to the Fed continuing to tighten on the Fed funds rate. Specifically in the March 1 forecast, they became a little more bullish. They moved off the mild recession forecast and into kind of a soft landing forecast, meaning they were encouraged by the kind of relative strength in the jobs market in particular. They were encouraged by the kind of continuing revenue coming in at the state level as well. Specifically, they noted that we had a 21.9% increase in the total income tax liability for federal tax year 2021. This was in state proceeds. We had seen kind of a 25% increase per annum over the last 5 years in the corporate excise and corporate income tax rates. They were projecting a little bit of a softening in that relative growth rate, but they were noting that that was continuing to be relatively strong. So in essence, the bottom line for purposes of revenue allocation was a $180 million increase into their forecast for the fiscal year 23-25 biennium general fund takings for the state of Oregon specifically. The personal kicker at that point was $3.9 billion is what they were projecting, with a corporate kicker of $1.5 billion. Most of the tax accounts that they were looking at, both income and excise as well as consumption taxes, were performing well, with the notable exception of the cannabis tax. So we have overbuilt that sector apparently. We have a glut in product in the market, and they were projecting an 11% decrease over the next biennium in the takings there. That translates to $36 million in that revenue source. And we do get some cannabis tax, though a lot of that, of course, was swept by Measure 110 and now goes to a different fund that no longer provides support for different areas. So that's where we were going into essentially the preparation of the governor's recommended budget. Yeah,
Can
go
I
ahead.
just say, I want to just add one thing about the difference between the March forecast and the June forecast, right? Is that or the May, what we call the May forecast, but the March, there was some income tax that had already been paid, but not, the data is much more robust
Yeah, that's true.
in May, right? Because we're past that April 17th deadline from this year. So while they had a little bit of data, they really are forecasting. Now they've got, there will still be people who haven't paid, obviously under extensions and stuff, but they'll have a much more sort of accurate picture.
Yeah, that's perfect. So we'll have actual data. So with the governor's recommended budget, one of the things the governor recommended specifically was, and I think to some extent we saw this coming out of the OEA forecast. The OEA projected that we would hit our statutory limits for the rainy day fund and the Education Stability Fund in 2026 specifically. So under law, the rainy day fund is capped at 7.5% of the general fund, and the ESF is capped at 5%. So the governor made the argument that we have ample reserves at this time, and in proposing her recommended budget to the legislature, she proposed that we not allocate additional funds into the reserve funds, that we put that into play. She's pointing out that we have an emergency in housing, and she's making the case specifically that we have ample reserves that can help us through even the more modest kind of revenue hit that we would take under a recession, which was less likely based on the most recent forecast, the March forecast. Yes, so that's where we were going into the legislative session. Now, she called for $130 million off the bat, and she called for a 30-day bill, basically, on housing. So she got her housing bill done in record time. House Bill 2001 swept a number of provisions into a larger agenda for housing production and shorter-term housing. And then, of course, she has marshaled much of the $130 million into her all-in initiative, right? And so you heard the housing, the Human Services Division present in Health and Human Services a few days ago about specifics related to the all-in Lane County component, the 30-some-odd million dollars that we're receiving for the housing emergency through January. Yeah.
I just want to make a point here that sweep that she did is in this biennium.
Yeah.
Right. So when we talk about what the forecast is setting up is for the next biennium, but there was quite a bit done to massage, if you will, the 21-23 biennial budget to make sure that she would come out of it, I think, with close to $200 million in I think 130 was for housing, but there was close to 200 million that was sort of re-appropriated, if you will, in this biennium.
And so a lot of that was vacancy savings and other dollars that had not been expended or previously appropriated dollars for which the agencies had not been able to work through the appropriation. So those were grabbed and pushed forward specifically and pushed out the door quickly. So the governor was recommending essentially a $30.1 billion budget, 42% of which goes to education. That's a $13.5 billion mark, 33% for human services. That's a $10.8 billion mark. 14% for public safety, and the remaining 11% essentially for everything else. The kind of top line talking points for the governor really was talking specifically about the 130 million mark for immediate action, and then $1 billion affordable housing production and preservation mark that the governor's advocating for specifically. Effectively, in the second priority the governor articulated was behavioral health. So she articulates some specific ongoing investments, but she's really, from a top-line perspective, pointing out that the legislature in 2021 appropriated $1 billion for behavioral health investments specifically, many of which those investments were still in play. And so she really kind of talked about, from a budget perspective, the importance of ensuring the effective distribution. So this includes, of course, 110 and some of the other efforts, but it's a wide range of activities, and we see this in place for residential beds as well for behavioral health as one example of the push to continue to move money through that system.
I just want to make completely sure I'm understanding. When you're saying in play, you mean basically through various bills that are still active, that's the money that would be there. It's not that she's creating her own whole initiative like the all-in, separate from legislative action on behavioral health, right?
That is absolutely correct, yes. And these are dollars that you're not going to see in this year's budget per se. These are previously appropriated dollars, but I think her primary focus is trying to get OHA to be more effectively able to administer those dollars and deliver results.
I would just say as well, Commissioner Trigger, that we expected, I mean, I certainly expected that the way that she had come out of the gate with the housing investment, that she would then have something either concurrent or right immediately after with a lot of innovative and bold steps on behavioral health, and that has not proved to be the case.
Yeah.
Essentially, and it could change yet, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but essentially the existing sort of behavioral health investments we're seeing are very traditional, so just sort of trying to keep that level of spending, but not the new and innovative stuff that we were expecting.
We had the thought leadership in that space really was from Representative Nose and Senator Weaver, as you know, and there were a number of concepts that were floating around, and we've seen maybe the most robust, certainly the one that the governor embraced in her recommended budget was the telecom tax, specifically to fund mobile services. So that bill is now in
Revenue.
It's in revenue?
Yeah.
Okay, and don't know if it's gonna move or not, but we'll see. And that's a revenue raiser that requires a 2/3 vote of
3/5.
3/5 on each side, and there you are. So we'll see if that goes or not.
Now, the other thing, remember, OHA, you know, we had a brand new director there, and then that didn't work out.
We didn't.
And then their behavioral health lead took some time to get hired. So I think part of it is, you know, that she may have had grand plans, but the personnel and the leadership positions kind of got a little stuck there.
Indeed. The other thing to note is a priority in the governor's recommended budget was really sorting out the Oregon State Hospital, specifically in some of the aid assist issues there. So she is highlighting specific investments at the Oregon State Hospital to help decompress the challenges that we have for aid and assist and for civil pipelines which back up here into our community and cause other challenges for us as well. And then, of course, education is the third of the governor's priorities. She is advocating for, in her budget, $100 million in bonding for early learning facilities and early childcare, $100 million for literacy, and $50 million for summer learning. So specifically, and again, just to reiterate, the governor recommended that we not fund the rainy day accounts. So that gets us to 4 weeks ago, we have the co-chairs of the Joint Ways and Means Committee putting forward their specific framework around the appropriations that they wanted to do. So specifically, they are setting an overall allocation. They are in fact proposing to fund the rainy day accounts, so they differ with the governor in terms of that particular point. One of the things that's on the table is the construction of the I-5 bridge over the Columbia as well, and Oregon needs to come up with $1 billion for our share of that project. The Washington legislature has concluded, they have put their billion forward, and the rest is federal. So we are on the hook to figure that out. The governor would not like to use general obligation bond revenue for that. She would like to find a revenue support for bonding our portion of that. So that piece is in play, and that's one of the big issues that I think we'll be looking at. Specifically for us, the co-chairs are proposing a $3.3 billion allocation for public safety, which for us, the governor had recommended a $4.4 billion, so that is a pretty significant difference in that particular pot. They are proposing a human services, $11 billion, whereas the governor is pretty close to what the governor was proposing there. But they were moving some money around, and so specifically maybe just thinking about some of the, you've heard certainly from Community Justice and the Community Corrections Act thus far and some of the issues associated with that budget area. We're seeing a flat allocation for that. So the governor proposed no increases in last biennium's allocation for that particular pot of funds. Zero funds for the Impacts Grant Program, which is an important program for us as well, and that's jointly administered by the Community Justice Commission and the Oregon Health Authority. I'm trying not to use acronyms. The Justice Reinvestment Initiative is, she proposed a $35 million mark there but that is sunsetting in this biennium as well. And so that's another revenue source that is important to that particular group. Though lately we are hearing some late-breaking interest in the Impacts program, so we've been advocating in that direction. So that brings us to where we are today. Joint Ways and Means, all the subcommittees, and there are quite a number of substantive bills that have made their way through various committees that are now sitting within various subcommittees of Joint Ways and Means. Many of them will not make it through, obviously, just by virtue of a volume of bills that are looking at, but some of them will start to happen. And once we get our revenue piece, I think we'll begin to see a pretty significant movement. It's worth saying all of this revenue forecast, all of this is obviously contingent upon a smooth transition through the debt limit, and we're on the cusp of work at the federal level. So maybe I'll hand it to my colleague, Mr. Kyle.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a big if to what Steve just indicated, and that's some of the dynamics occurring at the Capitol as we speak. You know, it's really interesting to watch this session. The co-chairs were very austere in their framework, and then there were sort of these dueling press conferences where the governor was out saying what she wanted, and then the co-chairs would put their press releases out and say what they wanted. So it's kind of interesting to watch it. I do also want to just say that, you know, there's a lot of parallels, right, between what you guys are doing now and how this all evolves at the state level. You know, back in April is when agencies start putting forward their agency request budgets to the governor. The governor then evaluates those, just like Administrator Mokrahysky takes a look at his directors and what they want, and then he finalizes his proposal to you. Same thing with the governor. She puts forth a proposal to the legislature, and then the budget committee or the legislature sort of does their thing and makes their final recommendation. I mean, it's a little different here in that it's a recommendation, whereas in Salem, it is the legislatively approved budget that is what drives the biennial spending. That said, we are at a real stalemate. So last Tuesday was sort of it was a very tense session that followed really very tense sessions in the Senate throughout the session. And on Wednesday morning, the Republicans, all but two, had walked off the Senate floor. So they denied quorum, and they've done that now in a couple sessions. You'll recall voters passed Measure 113 in Oregon that was an attempt to put a stop to that. It does require that if there are 10 unexcused absences of a member, they are prohibited from running for re-election. So that clock started to tick last Wednesday. And then it got really accelerated because typically this session, they have not been, the Senate nor the House has really been holding floor sessions on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, but last weekend, Senate President scheduled floor sessions for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, so it sort of accelerated the timeline. There were negotiations they only started yesterday to try to break the stalemate, and it was really nerve-wracking because Friday would have been the day that at least a few members, 4 members specifically, would have hit their 10 days of unexcused absences. So as of yesterday, at least a concession was made by the Senate President that he would not schedule floor sessions for tomorrow, Saturday, or Sunday. So a little bit of pressure has been relieved. Whether that's, I think it's a good sign. I will say that there's a lot of unknown still about exactly what the sort of outcomes that the Senate Republicans want over this walkout. But I think it's a good sign that they have relieved a little bit of pressure. They had another meeting this morning. I think they'll continue to meet and then see if they can come back and actually get the Senate back up and running next week. I had an interesting meeting with we have a bill that's very much in limbo, and I met with the Senate President's office, and they assured me that that bill is going to move, and I was like, okay, I took that as a good sign that there are positive conversations occurring. So that's what we know. Now, the walkout only stopped things on the Senate floor. So committees continued. As long as they have a majority of members present, they can continue the committees, they continue joint Ways and Means. So there was a lot of things that were in play that continued to be in play, particularly in the House, but it is really stacking up the calendar that will hit the Senate. And they have successfully taken a week off the calendar. There is a mandatory adjournment on June 25th, and although they can extend it, that takes a 2/3 vote to extend, and I think it's highly unlikely that they can garner a 2/3 vote. So those are the dynamics that we're experiencing right now in Salem. I think there is a lot of positioning, including work that I'm doing, to try to be like, okay, where I had bills that really don't have a whole ton of policy, trying to push them into what's called a budget note, where they could sit in a budget and sort of do the same thing. And then I think there's going to be a lot of pushing to put money into the end of session, what we call Christmas tree bill, or there's a couple final end of session appropriations bills, and I think those will probably look somewhat different this year, given the calendar. So speaking of, sort of political stalemates, as Steve indicated, I think one of the things we'll see next week with the forecast, the staff at Economic Analysis always do threats to the forecast, and so I think the political debt ceiling will definitely be a threat to the forecast. And what we learned this morning from our federal team is that they're really the sort of the date that people are most nervous about is June 1. Secretary Yellen can do certain things that administratively to try to extend it. The debt, the need for the debt vote for as long as possible. They're called special account measures, but she's indicating she can't do anything more after June 1st. Leader McCarthy has a proposal to cut $4.8 trillion over 4 years, but it would cap discretionary funding at FY22 levels, and that is really both dead on arrival in the Senate, and President Biden has threatened to veto that. So it's a bit of a stalemate. They did have meetings on Tuesday and then a meeting again tomorrow. Everything is sort of pointing toward Leader McCarthy. I think President Biden was really hoping that he could, bring his friend Leader McConnell into the conversations, and Leader McConnell has said, no, you have to talk to Leader McCarthy. So we'll see what happens tomorrow. And as in Salem, there's a lot that's now stalled. Appropriations are stalled, and then we've got a Memorial Day break that's coming up, and that's another week out of the congressional calendar. So anyway, it will probably be part of the discussions at the May forecast conversation next week. So that's where we're at. I mean, I wish we had much better news, but like I said, by next week. And we sort of always get into this dynamic where the state budget is a little bit uncertain by the time these conversations are pretty robust, but it is what it is. So happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
Do we have questions for our presenters? There's,
I just have one. And it's a curiosity question, because I don't get to see y'all very much, so I was just gonna throw out a question. When you were talking about all the money that we have and that the state's ample reserves and the government's not gonna allocate more funds, it seems to me like on one end of the stick, we got some flush money, and my question is, with all this housing attention, is there any chance the state would adopt an idea that they could be partners in development for, like, maybe with this flush money, put it out as low-interest loans that are below the market rate, so that maybe that would stimulate investor construction?
Commissioner Lovell, I mean, I think the Governor Kotek has obviously made a real priority over housing, and as has Majority Leader Julie Fahey, one of our. I think they would love to do the kinds of things you're talking about. I'm not sure they can really do the interest rate thing unless they have sort of there's been some talk over the years about having a state bank. But that's where this tension lies, where the governor really wants to invest in housing, and she is adamantly trying to get the co-chairs to dip into the reserves so that she can do that. And the co-chairs are like going, mm-mm. Now, I've seen this play a bunch of times, right? The co-chairs always are very austere. And so it really is, they probably really wouldn't want to admit it, but they can really change their tone after the forecast, because it becomes so evident, like, that there's a lot of money that in the state coffers. And I don't know, I'm personally feeling pretty good that March was right, and that May will confirm that and show that there is additional revenue, and so their framework will likely change. But there are so many people up there asking for money. I think it's very functional for the co-chairs to be like, there's just not enough money, and so it's a good way to keep everybody at bay. But we testified last week on a couple of different end of session bill and a lottery bonding bill, and there were some very large requests for funding.
Yeah, well, I guess the reason I asked that too is because in the last couple of weeks, I've met with probably 3 or 4 people that have properties just around our area that are perfect for cottagey housing. I mean, I'm counting off the top of my head, I think there's probably 300 units that we could build, but the problem is they're mom and pop organizations trying to get money, and the cost of money is so high. So am I thinking, if we got money in the state, why don't we loan it to people that are willing to do the work for us?
The other interesting dynamic I'll point out, and I was in conversation with a colleague in the hallway in Salem yesterday. The Housing and Community Services Department, which is managing the large tranche of money from the rebounds and would have to manage this new investment, is signaling like they're going to have a real challenge of getting that much money out the door. And we've experienced this. You may recall some conversations that we've had with the board, pretty frustrated about that department's ability to get wildfire recovery money out the door. And so it is a very interesting dynamic to watch when state agencies have so much money. They have a lot of money, but they just can't move it out fast enough. And what a frustrating dynamic for people
Yeah.
in the community.
I don't even have your job. It must be more frustrating.
Well, just building on Mr. Kyler's, just the point of reference is, the governor's proposed budget would in fact be a tripling of what we saw going into affordable housing finance in the last biennium. So it is a significant amount that would go through. I think that agency would absolutely have to think about some different ways of doing things. So there wouldn't be a specific allocation down, The third of the governor's 3 housing orders, however, created a policy board which is meeting in short order and offering recommendations. And they did offer their first report recently, and one of them was streamline what OHCS is looking at specifically, right? Help them narrow their focus, because they, might need to really think about how they're going to execute with alacrity.
Their reputation precedes.
Alex.
So more of a comment than a question. What we're struggling with downstream, we're flapping in the current of partisan politics. And it's both sides of the aisle. It's not Republicans, it's not Democrats, it's both sides of the aisle. They won't budge, they won't come together, they won't compromise. And I'll tell you, it can happen in the 72nd legislative session. We needed one Democrat vote to pass the budget, one Democrat vote, and it wasn't going to happen. We went clear into August. Anybody who was there knows we went clear into August. And what happened at the end? 11 Republicans went the other way. So that was a matter of bipartisan working together to make the budget happen. They won't do it. They're not doing it. And it's not fiscal stuff. A lot of this stuff has nothing to do with the finances of the state. It's personal beliefs, personal ideology that a partisan government is always going to give you. The only prescription is get rid of parties in Salem.
There's a very interesting, to Commissioner Farr's point, there's a real juxtaposition between the Senate and the House this session. The House has figured out how to get along, and they have really respected one another. They've managed to just very much business as usual, traditional order. Things are going very swimmingly over there. The Senate all session long has been very much different.
Just the opposite in the 72nd. We had a balanced Senate, 15-15 in the Senate. They worked together like a chorus. They really did. I mean, it wasn't bad at all. But with the House back then, just, needed one vote to pass the budget, couldn't get one vote, so 11 went the other way. And there's a scale.
You're running the meeting just fine.
Well, our chair has now arrived, so I will
My
abdicate back.
apologies.
Oh, no.
My apologies, I had to meet with a federal legislator. So, are
We're-
we
we're
done with the
just-
legislative update?
Well, we're in the question and right now. And so,
What if?
Any other
what if?
questions?
Yeah. So that's where we are right now.
Any other questions for Mr. Kyler or Mr. Adams?
Well, you all do great work. I'm super impressed every time I sit at a table and hear what you guys say. So just offer that as we're proud and glad to have you.
You bet.
If you've not, most of us here have witnessed them work together in Salem. It really is. It's like a concerted effort that I've never seen anything close to it before. So.
And when they walked in the room, just to see the two of them together, if you were to brand a look, this is the look.
We will know, it's really interesting. They call it the Christmas tree bill, right? The end of session bills, and it really is pretty amazing because you don't typically see it until maybe 2 days, 3 days before they adjourn, and there's a lot in there to digest. And so I will, probably next time I see you will be an end of session report, and it'll focus heavily on what was in the Christmas tree bill and what sort of implications that has for the agency, for the county, and certainly last couple of years, there's been fair amounts of revenue in that bill that we've then adjusted in a, what do we call your supplementals? Yeah.
Is that the meeting where we all wear ugly sweaters for Christmas when we come back?
Well, I can attest to seeing Mr. Kyler in the halls of the Capitol. That happened earlier this week. He's there doing the good work, so
Yep.
thank you very much.
You notice how people kind of congregate around Alex in those hallways.
Well, he had to yell at me as I was running the other direction. But yes, he had a lot of people around him.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you. So the next item on the agenda were presentations, TBD. Did we have any additional?
That was one of the-
We actually have changed that agenda, so I think was the new agenda handed out in the packets, I believe, that were on your table.
last
But
week's
there were no,
No.
nothing brought forward, but we decided to do a brief budget recap for you.
Great.
So, and I'll just start out by saying, just listening to the conversations, we thought we should just talk a little bit more about the general fund. You know, on that first night, I told you about how the structural deficit for 23-24 is 2.6 million, but it was worse than that when we started. So I felt like even though we've mentioned some things to you as a committee, we haven't like detailed it for you. How did we get to 2.6? And just so you're aware of the risks that are out there with what's happening there. And then highlighting some of the funds that you did hear about through the presentation. So this is going to be a bit of a Debbie Downer slide show. But just feeling that
Debbie
we all
doesn't
want
like that, by the way.
Sorry. Christine Downer.
I wonder how that was gonna fly.
So just making sure that we all stay aware. It doesn't mean that there's not plans. It doesn't mean that we're not going to come up with solutions. Of course we will, but we just want to keep it in everyone's mind. So
She spells that Debbie different. It's got two eyes.
exactly. There we go. So you saw part of this slide, but I added the few items at the bottom that are in italics as you heard presentations from departments. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way, as you're all going back and go forward. How about that? So you heard from us that the general fund, land management fund, and the parole and probation sub-fund are structurally imbalanced. You also heard from Health and Human Services about the spending of reserves in public health. And then the Human Services Division in particular, kind of highlighting some of their costs and the service needs that are occurring, and so that creates an imbalance there. And that, they do rely on the general fund pretty heavily when those things happen. And then the road fund shared with you that there's some future concern there. So you did see this slide during the first night. This was kind of where we have ended up with the proposed budget being $2.6 million structurally imbalanced, and kind of why some of that happened. But I'll go into a little more detail here and step it back a step. So when we received the adjusted base budget from departments, which adjusted base means tell us same services for next year at next year's costs. So, and what revenue they were anticipating. So the general fund actually had a 7.26 structural imbalance at that point. So the steps that were taken, you did hear us mention the increase to vacancy variance. So this is arrived at by looking at the fund as a whole and making sure we're not going too far. We're not trying to cause a reduction with the vacancy variance. We really are trying to get to how many positions typically sit vacant in the year as turnover happens. So we went from the regular 3% that we've done in the past to 5.5%. We do believe that's sustainable for the fund, at least for what we've been seeing in the last few years. But we'll continue to watch it, and we do have reserves contingency available if a department came back and said, hey, I can't make this. So we also, you heard about the changes in Health and Human Services. So they, especially communicable disease, moved from general fund supported to the community health centers supporting that service. They also had another one position that I don't remember if they mentioned, it's a resource development position that the general fund used to fund, and they've moved that to it being funded by their department, that one FTE. They all benefit greatly from that position that goes out and finds grants for them. You heard about the community corrections in JRI. So when the adjusted base was created, it was built the old way, where we have assumed the lower amount. And then the decision was made in the proposed to say, hey, we need to put forward what we need in order to keep these services within community justice and the sheriff's office stable. And so we adjusted the budget at that time. You'll notice there's a little plus there. So some of that impact has to be developed once we really get the final number. But that was what was added to the budget in the general fund. So community justice, parole and probation is not in the general fund. So that part of that funding is in their sub-fund that I mentioned, yeah.
But if we don't get the funding that we hope for, that would increase our structural imbalance.
It will.
Yeah.
It will, yeah. We did look at, all revenues out there, which we had been doing even as the adjusted base was turned in, but there was just one in particular in assessment taxation. We asked them to budget just a little more aggressively. All of the revenue estimates are estimates, but just what we're seeing in actuals, we thought this one tax fee that they receive has been trending higher, so we asked them to increase the budget there. You heard about the 2 FTE that were reduced in youth services. They actually reduced their general fund ask, not by a lot, but a piece of that. They didn't feel that they needed the 23,000, so that was a piece of it too. You didn't hear directly from county administration, but there was a affordable housing position added into the general fund 2 years ago, last year, I think. Maybe. Yeah, a couple years. And so the decision was made to move that out of the general fund into the video lottery supported. So that reduced there. There were then 2 changes that went the other direction at the time, between this time frame. So there were some salary changes approved by the Board of Commissioners for our prosecuting attorneys. Those were then built into the proposed. And there was the addition of the 2 FTE in the district attorney's office and a half FTE in emergency management. So all of those get you down to the 2.6 million. And then I've just shown the numbers for you of the ongoing revenue and ongoing expense, which the difference is the 2.6. The deficit will be higher by the time we get to 24, 25. So that's still going to be in development. It really depends on what revenue comes in at out in our departments. Many times we don't know that until we're getting that adjusted base turned in. Those areas like the CAFA grant, the recording revenue, we'll be watching those closely, and then wages growing. So it shouldn't be, the hope would be it doesn't grow like it did between the 2 years, because you actually heard the same number from me last year. It was just under 3 million of structural imbalance, and then it did grow over the year. So some of these will hold and some of them won't. So just wanting to point them out for you. And then you did hear us mention a few places where there are, and these aren't impacting the structural imbalance because I've taken them into account, but there are places where we are funding limited in duration positions or services with reserves. And so when we run out of those reserves, this will just be an impact. So this is more an impact or something to keep in mind, that we do have these places where we're spending one-time money in the general fund. So expanded patrol, we've got 2 kind of levels of that, where we use some general fund, road fund reserves, and then we're using the last Secure Rural Schools renewal. Half of that was put into a reserve for the sheriff's office. So that's $2.7 million annually that's occurring with those. And as you heard from the sheriff's office, they will taper off over the next couple of years. One of them ends before the other one. There's 2 limited duration positions. So there's one in the budget office and then one in emergency management. We also have ARPA expenses in the general fund. There's a couple FTE being funded, including your ARPA staff. That are, yes, they have specific tasks related to that will go away, but then of course there is FTE associated with those. So just being aware of that funding supporting FTE. And then we have the Holiday Farm Fire Program Manager that is funded with reserves, which the hope would be that eventually that need goes away, but doing a lot of work there around those services. Anything you want to add on general fund? I'm gonna tag you in this, but I'm putting them on the spot.
Well,
Yeah,
you're
okay.
doing such a great job. There's a trend here.
All right. So then I just grabbed some of the information from the department presentations, just to kind of highlight the land management fund was one that we heard about, that it has the structural imbalance. They'll be looking at fees, working on developing plans there, looking at the stormwater permitting. The CCA state funding, just pointing out that that does impact the 2 funds. General fund is the sheriff's office, and then parole and probation is in its own sub-fund. Parole and probation also is not only dealing with the change in the percent that we will be allocated, they're dealing with the fact that last biennium, we plugged part of their deficit with some ARPA funds. So even if things had stayed stable, we still knew that that ARPA fund money wouldn't repeat. So a little more drastic impact there, but they would develop and they would have to reduce FTE. Health and Human Services, this is their slide about public health, just with their spending reserves. And they'll be having to be look at fees for environmental health, and then just some of the other things that are challenges for them this next year. This is their slide. And then the Human Services Division, where they explain that the costs related to administration, when we receive funding from other sources that don't allow us to apply an administration fee to them, those things all become draws on the fund, and they rely on general fund for those. Because many times those allocations they receive are very specific for services. It's more through funds that are going directly out to agencies. And then finally, the road fund. While it is structurally balanced, Dan Hurley, the director there, did share that that's not going to last for long with its current state. So this is just the picture of their, what we refer to as the JAWS graph, becomes the JAWS when it flips direction. You don't want the expenditures above the revenue. So showing what their forecast is showing right now. All right, that's all the Debbie Downer stuff. Do you want to add any?
I mean, Christine covered it, but I'll just point out again, as you heard from Alex and Steve, a number of state funding impacts that we're waiting on. It's highly possible to likely that CCA dollars, as you've indicated, will come in less than we projected. Again, we've called that out, but trying to be really clear about it, but we also feel like that conversation needs to be made public. So there is a future action that the board will need to reconcile if that does come to fruition. The other ones highlighted here, fee adjustments. I mean, you just see how tight the budget is, that the limitations on the general fund in terms of funding the relatively low level of service that we're funding in public safety and assessment taxation, some of these areas, we have very little options than when we have what you see. This, if you go back to the JAWS graph, I mean, this is really the thing that concerns me over time, is every year we close this gap either by using reserves, which then just, it makes us feel like the gap is closed, but it's not. For 1 year it's closed, and then it actually gets bigger because we're pushing the problem out and the expenses continue to grow faster than the revenues. So this is the structural problem. I mean, we have two real issues. One is our core level services are underfunded because of our low property tax rate and loss of timber revenue, right? So we're not funding certain critical services at the level we need to fund them at. That's problem one. And the secondary problem is we have a structural imbalance. So even the services that we are funding, they're at risk because our expenses just continue. And as long as our wages and benefits grow more than our revenues, do we have an average for revenue like in the general fund?
Just over 3,
Over
yeah.
3%, and
Just
our
over
expenses are growing probably 5%. That's the gap. I mean, it's a pretty simple, it's not like really complex. And I would argue the expenses aren't growing for bad reason. Like we're trying to keep, and we're doing a much better job. Recruitment and retention, you look at the talent in the organization, our ability to meet the needs of the community and come up with creative solutions to the challenges that we face. It's largely by having good people that are dedicated to doing their work. They're the best at what they do, and so we want that. But in order to have that, you have to pay competitive wages and benefits to get those people and keep those people. So, you know, this is the balancing act that we have to do over time. So I mentioned the state impact, and then, you know, you also see a lot of pressure on fees. So you saw this highlighted I think you heard land management say yesterday, 2 days ago, and environmental health is the other one that, because those, I've said this in a number of other counties, their general fund subsidizes land management. So they can keep their fees at a level that they feel like is reasonable for their community, for their customers. Understanding it's an important service to the community, so we're going to subsidize that service with general taxpayer dollars. And we don't do that here. We rely almost exclusively on the fees to cover the cost of providing the service. So what that does is two things, of course. It impacts the level of service we can provide, and it pushes the extent of the fees that we need to charge. So I just say that, these are going to be decisions that the board is going to have to reconcile with in the coming months. Our fee adjustments, I'd say particularly in those two areas, land management and environmental health, they they are expected to not be small adjustments. I mean, these are not like, and I know we say CPI is not small either right now, but, you know, above CPI, certainly above CPI level adjustments. That was a Danny downer, I guess. Can we say something good?
What are you calling the current CPI? Because I've
Well-
heard some debate on what it really is on
Well,
different
yeah,
committees I've been on.
I
so-
don't know that I have the best answer to that. Probably somewhere in the 5% range, give or take.
That would be,
Maybe-
that would be calendar year probably. So we do, I just looked at it this morning actually because April was released this morning.
It was
So
just released,
we
yeah.
look at the fiscal year because that's when we
Right.
do COLAs and that's what we're focused on. So it's just under 3 for the fiscal year. So it does appear to be doing better as we've gone through,
It appears artificially
Yeah.
low when it really isn't.
yeah, for now. We still have, so that's through April. So 2 more months in the fiscal year. It's definitely gone down from what it was, yeah.
You know, I will say, to maybe try to end this part of the conversation on a more positive note, if you look at what our values have been in Lane County over, you know, at least the past decade, since 2012, when big cuts and 200 positions were eliminated from the budget in the organization, we have not gone that route. We've intentionally said we don't want to cut positions because it just cuts service to the community. And it hasn't been demonstrated to me, and I think most other folks, that there's a need for a reduction in service, and if anything, we need an increase in service in certain areas. So we don't want to, we want to try not to impact employment and services to the community. We're trying to be competitive with wages and benefits. You know, we don't want to necessarily pay over the market, and we don't want to pay under the market. We want to pay competitively, and then we want to have a workplace culture, an environment where people want to come because and that's the thing that I think we hear pretty consistently, that people choose to come here and they choose to stay because they really like the culture and the environment and the way that the county does its work. You know, and then our approach on the budget, and if you look at, you know, what's happening in other places, in other local government budgets, we really have tried not to, you know, cut those really critical things that trigger the community, that are really valued and important to the community. We've tried to be thoughtful about targeting internal expenses, managing resources efficiently, doing these things like the vacancy variance. You know, these are sort of wonky budgeting sort of things, but we think that they're good practices to deploy if they can help us preserve the service levels that we have. But I would tell you that we can only do that for so long. We're not gonna be able to continue to push vacancy variance, right? So that was a big thing you see here. We went from 3% to 5.5%. So we're capturing a lot more savings by expecting, and we will diligently manage budgets, and it is squeezing departments. So we are saying, you know, you're gonna have a little less resource to do things. So there will be impacts to these things, but we're trying not to have them be drastic, significant things. I think that's what we have for you. We just wanted to cover, I think we realized, you know, we kind of threw a lot out the first night, and then we jumped into departments. We wanted to just recap and bring it back up to a high level, and open to any questions, thoughts, or interests that the budget committee wants to pursue.
Please.
Steve, thank you for that. Can you back up to that, John? Slide, please. So, I very much appreciate the way that that county staff and the budget office and you, Steve, as this being your proposed budget, have handled the budgets over a great number of years now. You know, reserves were built for situations like this. That's why we have reserves, and that sounds good. Problems like this, you basically have that question about whether you can sustain services. You either have to cut services or you have to generate more revenue. These are pretty significant. Sounds like to me we don't know how that's going to play out, but that's a serious issue. Is that the right way to? I mean, this is just one example. You know, that pretty much we don't have a path forward.
No, I'd call those two issues out, that we've got we've got a problem in terms of certain services, core services that are underfunded, historically underfunded, probably, what, for the last 2 to 3 decades. There's been that kind of slide, particularly in the kind of public safety realm. And then there've been other services where we've, because of federal and state priorities and more investment, we've been able to grow. So that's what, we talked about this in the budget message, that, it's interesting, because when we talk about we have a difficult budget challenge, it's also true that we've grown our workforce has grown 40% in the past 8-9 years, and our budget has grown. So, well, how do you have a budget problem? But if you look at where it's grown in certain places, and then obviously it's been constrained in others. So again, I'd say we have 2 problems. One is, and the board certainly understands this, and public safety, there's public safety funding question on the ballot next Tuesday, and I think there's a longer term public safety question about, what's the best and right way to shore up that system, the whole system that needs to function together. It's investments in all the different, whether it's prosecution or law enforcement or corrections or mental health and housing and substance abuse and probation. All that stuff has to be adequately funded and adequately coordinated and synchronized. So that's one, is how do we like stabilize the long-term funding of those core services? Then the other question is this one that I think you're hitting on, the JAWS piece. Well, how do we, on some level, this is something we're always going to contend with. Because either your revenues flatten or decline, and you have to make adjustments. Or in this case, what's been interesting is we've been, revenues really are growing, but the market is such. You have CPI and you have labor market demands, and so what we've really seen has not been necessarily a huge concern in terms of revenue declines. It's been more so the expense side, and because of the market demands growing. So, but one of those 2 things is usually always going to be the case, right? From like an economic standpoint, you're going to see revenues flatten or decline. So you have to have that conversation, or you're going to see, a roaring economy, and then a demand for wages to grow, and you have to contend with it there. This, Christine said what was it last year? 3%, or sorry, 3 million, 2.5, 3 million. Again, we got it down to about 2.5, 3 million again this year by making a bunch of adjustments. It's probably where we're going to continue to see that pressure. So yeah, I guess your question was, are we going to continue to contend with this? Yeah. What's the solution? I don't know, other than, continue with sort of the approach that we've tried to have, which is stabilize, and where we see energy and opportunity. The pandemic was both a challenge and an opportunity. It created big growth, demand, and need. There was funding that came in to support that, great. But then the funding dries up, and now we're still sort of reconciling with some of that. I think you're seeing that in public health in particular, of like, oh boy, we have to right size here because now we don't have the funding in the future to pay for all the things that we have invested in. So I think the answer to the question is going to vary in future years, but it's important for the budget committee in your role to understand both of those dynamics, that there's this one, you got to figure out how to kind of keep those lines as close to each other as possible. And then we got to figure out how to deal with this long-term shoring up. And I do actually think that if we can get closer to answering that question, how do we adequately fund some of those core public safety services in the long term? We talked about the Deschutes type structure. If you can do that, then I wouldn't say all the problems go away, but you sort of limit, in my eyes at least, you sort of create a little bit more focus and limitation on the extent of the impacts.
I do agree with that. I think people will be very, I guess they'll be very focused on if there was a public safety initiative to go forward for a different funding model in that area, that it'd be in addition to what they have now, type of thing. And not that doesn't give you a lot more, by having that one taken care of, it gives you gives you an easier time focusing on other things, because that's such a big thing. One of the point differences with public safety, for example, what we've done with public safety over time is actually decreases in services. If you look back in the last 15 years, right? You know, there's no patrol, there's nothing that there was previously. Secure rural schools or timber funds before that. It's hard to cut back on road stuff, right? Because there's not, what are you gonna do? Stop patching them, stop fixing signals, I don't know, type of thing. So that's a little bit more question, although they were talking about the revenue sources for that as well. So I'm glad that you guys are at the helm with this. So I'll just put that out there.
One quick thing, I know there are other questions, but we have time, right? But this is an important discussion that we did, I mean, think about roads and the folks that were around and had in the community. 2017 was the bill for the transportation package, right? So that was 6 years ago. So go back 7 to 8 years. When I first started, remember we went off the vehicle registration fee. We were very much in a situation where, like the general fund is in right now around public safety, is like the money had fallen out. We didn't have the funds to be able to support the long-term investment. We asked the community, they said, no, we don't like that tax fee. The state then went and did a year, 2 years later, because in 2015 we asked, and then in 2017 the legislative session approved statewide funding. So that's the other thing that we need state help, right? Counties are agents of the state. We were created to keep, if you look at the service we provide, vast majority of it is on behalf of the state. And in some cases, the state funds us well to do it. In a lot of cases, they don't. And they've broken the promise over many years in legislatures and governors. You know, public safety funding in particular. So we've been in, I would say that's another potential, is that we need, the state did come in and help us solve the transportation problem, because we were in that position of not funding. We weren't doing road maintenance. And it's like not maintaining your house. The roof's gonna cave in at some point if you don't repair it. It'll cost way more to fix that down the road. So I think that's the other thing, is from a legislative and lobbying standpoint, is continuing to keep these really core community service challenges at the forefront of the dialogue, so that the legislature understands the severity of the problem.
Because you brought up, Steve, is there anything at the state level for public safety that provides filling the gap, or was that just, I don't know any model for that?
No,
Okay.
there's not. That's what we're saying. CCA, for example, is we're kind of calling that out, going, this is just, the funding continues to decline. It's not keeping pace with what we need to. And so now our local taxpayers are having to cover that cost. When really, the CAFA dollars for A&T, they're covering 11% of what they used to cover 30 to 40%. It's a state-required service. So there's more and more burden being placed on local taxpayers for services that the state has historically required. And, you know, there's just, what we've seen is the legislature kind of isn't interested. They're interested in these other topics that are at the forefront right now, are emergency shelter and housing and homelessness and behavioral health, critical issues. But they're not focused on things that are also really critical that we're dealing with. So yeah, there has not been a solution to them. And public safety has not, frankly, been at the forefront of the priority list for the state as far as we've been concerned.
Commissioner Buck, then Commissioner Trieger.
Mine is related, actually, and in my discussions on transportation committees, this is a statewide gap issue. It's not just Lane County, this is everywhere, and the state is seeing the same forecast, and so they're gonna have to do something, again, to address it. But my specific question was regarding SRS funding. So we've had 3 years of a standard amount of a little over 3.8 million in SRS funding. Those 3 years were guaranteed back when it was appropriated at the time. This is the last year of that guaranteed funding. I haven't heard a peep about future SRS funding coming down from the federal government. Have you?
I have not, no.
And if it was, would it not be part of the current budget bill maybe this is an Alex and Steve question specifically, but I would think if that was gonna happen, it would be part of the national budget discussion.
Yeah, that is a timing question for Alex probably, but I will tell you that the last few renewals have been very, very late in the process. So when we've kind of given up hope, that doesn't mean that it's dead, I guess I would say, but we could check with Alex Kyler and see if he's hearing any more. The one thing I do want to point out about the general fund SRS though, because both the general fund and the road fund rely on SRS. When I'm talking about structural imbalance of the general fund, we are only counting what we believe we would have gotten from the timber harvest agreement as ongoing revenue. In the general fund, the SRS number is almost equal to that timber harvest number. Now, lumber prices are starting to go down, so that may well change, but in recent years, so the forecast has about 3.7 of that number that you just said as ongoing. We would have received that from timber harvest. Now, the road fund is completely different. They receive, close to 6-7 million, and their harvest number would be below 2 million. So that's where the big benefit is for us to opt into SRS, because a jurisdiction does have the option to say we want the timber harvest or we want the SRS. It's still a benefit. It's just getting very close to the line on the general fund. So we will watch, I receive monthly reports from BLM on their harvest, that's telling me the value of things, so we can see what our payment would be for timber, and it's delayed a year, so we'll know as we go into 24, 25, what the timber for the general fund looks like. And then the SRS in the road fund, we've also been treating that overage that I said as one-time money. So that was some of the money that was used for that expanded control, put into reserves.
So if you were, because the board has changed over the years, but several years ago, this was part of our strategy, was to wean ourselves off of the expectation of the SRS payment. And so that's where we are now, is we're only budgeting the timber harvest number, which is the bare minimum, right? So I thought the general fund, if we get an SRS pack, so if the federal government does approve a new round of us, we have senators that if Senator Wyden has been really effective at advocating for and securing secure schools payments, including as part of the ARPA package. We got 2 years, I think 2 years of.
It was like a one-time
Or-
payment
okay.
that was originally kind of connected to SRS.
So when we get those SRS payments that are in excess of what we budgeted, we book them into reserves, and we'll have a conversation about using those for one time. And that, I would argue, what we would love to see is if the federal government said, here's a 10-year package, we guarantee 10 years of SRS payments, well, that, at a higher level than you've had, that would actually allow us to have a conversation about additional investment in services. But we're doing this year after, does this make sense? So, we're in a pretty safe and stable position as it relates to what, at this point, whatever the federal government does in terms of SRS payments is arguably gonna be to our benefit. It's not gonna take anything more away, because we're always gonna get a harvest payment.
So you, in this line item, under O&C timber sales, which includes the general fund SRS,
That is only the general fund
Yeah.
SRS
Yes.
that you're seeing there, yes.
you're telling me that that number is potentially stable after this guaranteed 3-year? Because that's not what I was anticipating. What I was anticipating was, this is a guaranteed amount for this particular proposed fiscal year. Following year, next year, there's a potential of saying, we are $3.8 million short if it's not renewed.
It wouldn't be 3.8 million. All the timber harvest would have to go away, and that won't happen. So the timber harvest right now is running about 3.7 of that, and we would receive that. So if SRS goes away, we go back to the 50-50 split on timber harvest. So we would receive timber payment.
So what you're
What
saying,
drives that, I'm sorry, Commissioner, what drives the fluctuation, what's at risk here is more the market condition. What the price of lumber is in the market and the amount of logging that occurs. Does that make sense? So
no,
if there-
it's not making
She's
sense.
questioning the number. That
I'm
is the
question-
SRS number that you're seeing.
Right,
Right.
but you're saying 3.7 is harvest, but what portion of that, then the difference is $100,000 in SRS? That doesn't make mathematical sense.
Pretty close. It is, yes.
Really?
yes. We don't get much more from SRS in the general fund than we would get
Okay.
anyway with Harvest. A lot of that because the
Yeah.
That's
price
what I
of
mean.
timber has
That's the-
gone
yeah.
so high. Right, it used to be 2 million that we used to
Right.
project for timber, but the last 5 years, it's just continued to go up, yeah,
The bigger upside on SRS is in the road fund.
absolutely,
So
yeah.
that is why,
Okay.
in the last few years, we've had the conversation with the board and you've approved packages, these 5-year deals that have taken SRS funds that went to, when we have had these one-time SRS or 2 or 3 years of SRS payments, we've said, why don't we take the excess from the road fund and invest that in additional patrol? That's what, does that make sense?
So we have about $100,000 of the SRS in the general fund. The rest is all in the road fund.
Right. I guess you could look at it that way. I mean, we don't get the timber payment when we get SRS, so they would say that's all SRS, right? But they take our timber payment to pay for it, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
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 Giving our
I
money
was
back.
trying to get at
Not
that,
a few places.
that game, yes.
And that's what it is.
Commissioner Traeger.
Thank you. I also just want to acknowledge, this is my third commissioner budget cycle, but was also on the budget committee your first 3 years here, so what, 14, 15, 16. And H&HS is always the largest share, and this is the first year, I just want to on the record acknowledge our new leadership at H&HS for coming up with some structural changes that then impact their use of the general fund. But that is significant, and I think that's one of the things I'm always so impressed with, our ability to really keep fresh eyes, not keep the same structure and try to figure out revenue problem, expenses going up with this structure, but being willing to restructure and look at different ways we can move programs around to make them eligible to be funded in other ways. So that is fantastic. I think the 1115 waiver, you know, there's those kinds of things at the federal level that we're going to see in terms of impact on the community, and therefore the impact on need for services might be changing. I mean, I think we have such a big gap. I don't think we're going to like suddenly see people are fine and securely housed just because of the waiver. But I think it's also important to note those kind of really innovative structural changes is another puzzle piece that is significant. So I just wanted to state that because I think that's important. And then I also just want to advocate for us figuring out how to afford printing that dollar bill with a little note and inserting it into our property tax bills. Because,
Don't we do that? I thought that was
It's
Mike
on the
Cole's
flyer.
idea.
is it?
It's on the,
Okay.
yeah.
Because-
The mailer that goes out to
Yeah,
property tax?
there's a mailer.
Yeah.
Because that sense in the community of, I write such a big check to Lane County, why are you claiming you're broke? Without understanding that we only get 11 cents on the dollar
It's huge.
at Lane County, is a big part of the sort of problem with the public's understanding and appetite
Absolutely it is.
for paying for services that they demand and deserve. So I think that's something else, we've talked about this before, that one of the most important, I think, values, I know when I was the budget committee member as a community appointee, is you get to be that sort of ambassador out to everyday people to help them understand the challenges. Because it really, it's significant for the public to understand that.
Did you have a response?
Not exactly a response. I just want to share a little more, actually going back to Steve talking about the services, and back to Herb's question about what we're doing. So we also continue, I mean, we hit it on expenses just a little bit, but try and look for anything creative and like what you saw H&HS do, looking for revenue centers. But what happened, I don't remember if the budget committee heard about it because we issued the bond in June last year, but as an example, the PERS benefit is a huge expense to us. And so the board approved issuing a bond to pay our unfunded liability. Interest rates were very low back in June, so we were able to finance that debt, prepay PERS, and then the hope is that you earn enough interest on that money over 20 years that your PERS debt is lower. So we did issue the same kind of thing back in early 2000. It did prove well for us, so over the 20-year period. So we continue to look for anything like that where we can take some control of something that's a little bit out of our control, and can we do something to reduce our internal expenses? So building reserves, we have a PERS reserve that we're building that we can then reduce the PERS expense to our departments, which will impact the ability for them to provide more services. And same thing on health insurance, which you have heard a lot about in recent years. But we have a new benefits manager who's taking a fresh look at everything and really focusing on wellness and looking for, can we do anything to positively impact that expense without impacting the benefit to employees. So we continue to look for everything, sometimes going back and turning over the same rock that we did 10 years ago. Can we still get some water out of that rock? Yeah. Or we're just trying to think of anything new, constantly looking. Has anyone else thought of anything new? Using the policy lab at U of O, I saw a presentation from that group. We asked them to tackle the structural imbalance of the general fund. And what would they do? And they suggested all kinds of revenue sources for the most part, but some of them were very interesting. Hey, that's that, generation thinking up that idea too. So maybe that's something to explore in the future. So while we don't have definite plans for you yet, it's a constant, just a lot of minds working together to come up with ideas. So.
Last year, we had a budget committee member and the budget committee ended up amending and approving the budget to allocate video lottery dollars to help support land management, right? So that is one of the things that, while we're not dedicating general funds to land management, we were able to say, yeah, a portion of video lottery dollars that are intended to be used for economic development can support land management, because that has a direct connection to economic development, and so we were able to keep those services shored up for a period of time and not, significantly impact fees there. So, Christine brought up health insurance. You brought up the Health and Human Services. A lot of this is about where there's these discussions sort of evolve over time, and where there's energy and interest, sort of diving in there and seeing what we can do, and then you sort of exhaust, you extract as much as you can out of that well. And I think we've done that on the health insurance side to go, we're doing some really innovative and leading practices, which have led to us being highly rated in the state as an employer for our health and wellness programs. Let's keep doing that, but there's not much more we can sort of do in terms of using those solutions to solve our budget challenge. So then it's like, well, what about mindset? How do we think differently about? So I think it's a really good point, and just that we really look to everyone to go, do people have thoughts and ideas? Have we not? The video lottery example from last year, I think, was a good one. Was, I didn't come up with that idea. Christine didn't come up with that idea. We didn't really think about that. It came up at the budget committee, and it was a good idea for us to explore. So there's no such thing as a bad idea. If people have thoughts, and we can explore that. Again, I'll just thank you for calling out Eve Gray and Zach and the new team out at HNHS that is really just doing some awesome work and leading with an eye towards, we are one county. We're not a collection of 33 different funds, all doing our own thing and just focused on what we're doing. We got to function together as a team, and really we need more of that to permeate the organization.
Bruce, you had a question?
Well, I just want to add on to what Commissioner Trigger said, that I don't know if you, on Facebook today, I was watching about the jail levy and the comments. What does the county do with all their money? They're raising hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's just, and again, that was one of the reasons I told Steve way up front 2 years ago that that's why I wanted to be on here, was to help explain to people, because they're always saying this stuff, and I wanted to be able to answer it, to say, they only 11% is all that goes to the county. The rest is for all the other 85 taxing districts in the county. I just don't, I guess one at a time, eventually you'll get there, but that's just really, like I said, I read that today, earlier this morning, and it just really, I want to just take that person and shake them. Do you understand what this really happens? And people just don't. And the other part that I've talked with Steve and Christine about is, they don't realize how many services the county provides. I feel like I'm fairly well knowledgeable, being in, all my whole life here of stuff, and I didn't realize till 2 years ago all the different services that the county provides. You really don't have an idea all the different areas that they're involved with. And I just, like I said, I don't know how you get it all out there other than just doing what we're doing and keep doing it. But that's I think that's a biggie, because there's just so much it's not even misinformation, it's just misconstrued of what's happening. So that's it.
Government budgeting in high schools.
That might be a good point, yeah, that somebody understand how it really works.
How your school is funded.
How your school is funded.
That's a good one.
Is that a motion? I was ready to second it. Okay, I was just checking.
I think all young kids need to come work for the government for a little while and see what it's really like when you are a public employee. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. You know, there's a lot we can talk about this with this particular budget, and there's a lot of painful stuff in it, Steve and Christine, and everybody else who worked on it. But really, if you compare it to what you were doing 15 years ago, 13 years ago even, and Herb, what you came into 12 years ago, you know, what we're looking at today is almost incremental changes, whereas we had broad sweeping changes at that point in time. But significantly, since we started some of the policies that Steve Moker-Heisky and Christine talk about being standard policies here that weren't standard policies before. Like, what do we do with SRS? Well, what do we do with excess money? Well, you spend it, you establish a program, and then try and pay for the program later. We don't do that kind of stuff anymore. And that's why we're so close to a structurally balanced budget at all times. And that's why we should all be very, very pleased about the way the administration here in general, and not just in the departments, but the administration in general, is really a very conservative steward of our budget. In a way that makes it, this is relatively easy work. It really is for us sitting around this table, and you make it such. You know, I'm on the Bethel School Board Budget Committee. You know, it's a $200 million budget. It's not a huge budget. But there's a lot of discussion at the Bethel School Board about the county's role in how school districts operate. And virtually every other district receives a large portion of its funding from our tax dollars that we gather here. So, you know, Craig Sproul said something that reminds me of you, Steve, and you, Christine. We're not going to balance the budget by being conservative on how many copies we make. So we talk about, well, you know, why do we make so many copies? Well, that's, you know, the big things are what we're talking about in this room, what you've been doing for the last 8+ years, in particular, and Christine, since before I got here, you know, when, after the big cuts that were in 2011-ish, that period. Makes this work seem pretty easy to us. And Herb, I wish you would talk about your first year on the budget committee, because that is
Well, you do
a
make
story
some
to be
very
told.
good points. You know, maybe those were, to some extent, there was more money, or at least more. I felt back then that it wasn't quite so tight. The budget now is very squeaky, right? Very, which is good. That's actually a compliment. My early years, I think during that time, I learned a lot more about spending one-time money for one-time activities, because I think in some of those early years, it was more like a pot of funds and you were budgeting it out. Well, that can cause you problems the next year when you have continuing services that last year you paid with one-time money, and now you don't have that one-time money. So, but I think it's been very positive. So that probably caps it off.
Yeah, that's the one. That's a softball I threw. You just want to hit it hard. Good job. So by and large, you know, my compliment is to the work that goes on. And I'm looking at just the two of you, realizing there's a whole pyramid behind you that brings us to this point where we can actually, even in this tough budget where we're cutting, where we're using reserve money, we can still smile about it because we still have a positive outlook. And that would not have been the case if we would continued on the same path that we were on in 2013.
Where are we at in the agenda? I don't have one in front of me. Are we ready for, thank you.
Yes.
Are we ready for a break? Yes, I think we are. Oh, we're way past a break. So let's do 10, let's come back at 3:30, so that's about 7 minutes or so.
Sure.
Is that all right?
What are we coming back for?
We'll talk about the deliberation process.
yeah.
So I don't
Yeah.
expect it to even take as long as it had on the agenda. So we'll be
Okay, we'll
fine,
be
and
fine.
maybe still end early unless the committee has questions and thoughts. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Back here at 3:30, please.
All right. of the meeting, the very last page says Budget Committee Deliberation Process Guidelines. And this is the process that we've used for quite a number of years. The committee has liked it. We're always open for your suggestions. Of course, it's your process. So if you have any comments or questions as we go, let me know. So as you know, we meet next Thursday evening for deliberation, so no meeting on Tuesday. So we've had the process of budget committee members, if you have any suggestions, as was mentioned, a budget committee member previously brought forward the $650,000 in video lottery that goes to land management. This is the process that was used for that. So if you have a suggestion or a change you would like to see in the budget, if you could email that to me by next Tuesday at 5 p.m., and my email's on there, but you probably all have it from earlier emails. What I will do with that is, if a department is impacted, we'll send that to them so they can prepare to talk about it on Thursday. And we'll put together a list that we will send back out to the entire committee so that you see the list before you get there on Thursday as well. So we'll send that to you by midday Wednesday, so that you would have that available if there are any things there. And then just the rest of this just kind of talks about the process that we followed through that evening. So you will have a public hearing first thing, or public comment, sorry, we had the public hearing on the first night, but we'll have another public comment in case anyone either remotely or in person wants to talk with the committee. So we'll start the night with that. And then we'll just go through the known issues for discussion. That would be anything that I've received from you, if there are any emails received. And then the committee has typically, had those introduced by the committee member that brought them forward. And then there's a vote to, do we want to discuss these further and consider them? Usually it takes 4 votes to move it forward. So not a majority, but just a continued discussion of it. Then
4
you would
votes
go-
from the committee as a whole, not just 4 commissioner votes, right?
Correct.
Okay, I want to make sure.
Yeah, committee votes, yeah. Then we go on to, once the discussion happens, kind of going through each one and seeing if there's, we tackle each one at a time and take a vote on each individual item to see if you want to include it in the budget or not. Then we would go on to if there's any technical adjustments. There's no technical adjustments. Those would be more something that we just saw that was an error perhaps or something. We have nothing to bring to you there. But you did hear from Health and Human Services that they need you to add to the budget the All in Oregon amount. So we'll have that memo for you again and that amount in the worksheet. So we will be asking you to include that in your approved budget.
Is that this one for 5.2 million?
Yes, yes, that is it, yes. Once that's voted on, then we look to just discussion that the committee might want to have on the overall budget. And then we have the motions that you would approve. And we split out about 6 different motions. One to do the permanent property tax rate, and then the public safety levy, the OSU Extension Service levy that I don't know that all committee members have heard about, but that's money that comes through the county. It's our levy, but we pass it on to OSU Extension Service. And then the Parks levy will be a new one this year. We also will have a motion on the use of transient lodging tax for operations within Lane Event Center and parks. We just want to make it really clear the amount that they're allowed to use for operations, since they do that each year, so we'll have that number for you. And then finally, a motion to approve the entire budget. Any questions?
I have 2 questions. I don't even want to say this one out loud, but I'm actually not going to say the scariest possible thing out loud, but let's say the election, so the election is Tuesday, this meeting is Thursday. Results are not certified, but also now that the postmark counts, if it's a really close margin, I don't anticipate this is going to be the case. But in the event we can't yet know, what is the process for later? Does it just fall to the board? Does it have to be a special meeting of the budget committee to do the tax rate on the public safety levy renewal?
I believe we'd have to have the budget committee involved. I'm trying to think back, because I talked to the Department of Revenue about, because the budget that you have in front of you assumes passage of the levy.
Right.
So.
I'm assuming passage also.
Right, exactly.
But again, so because of the postmark law
Right,
now,
yeah.
instead of the,
Right. If it was
Yeah.
close, we'd have to check with them. There's times where we would have to publish something again, because I publish what the budget committee approves. So you're right, you can't approve a levy that has not been
Isn't
approved by the
decisive,
voters,
right.
right? So we would have to look at that timing and whether there is a instance where the board could get involved. Because of course, we're looking at that June 30th date of we have to have an adopted budget or we have no authority to spend on July 1st, yeah.
And then my other question is, do we not hear from the elected officials compensation board?
We will not hear from them now. They're still meeting and
So we don't
coming up
have
with
the next-
recommendation. Yeah, so we'll do a special meeting. That's what we've done
Okay.
in most recent years, just so you will get, a schedule from us here at some point to just have a quick afternoon meeting. We can even do it remotely if that's best for everybody and have them present to you.
Can you just explain that for the new?
Oh, sure. The elected officials compensation board makes recommendations for the compensation levels of our elected officials, which is the justice of the peace, the district attorney, the sheriff, the commissioners, the assessor. So they're working now. They've been meeting and they're coming up with their recommendations. I just received an email to provide them costing of what the impact would be. So they haven't seen that back to come with a final recommendation. So we'll come back to you later with that. Those typically, especially for the commissioners, a commissioner has to be, it has to go through general election. So it's pretty early in the year for us to be doing it for commissioners. Now, the other elected officials could be effective whenever the board decided.
And so we do those as a supplemental if there's changes?
Correct,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
The budget committee hears from the elected official comp board and then recommends to the board of commissioners. Whatever it recommends, then the board ultimately has to approve or deny that recommendation.
So just so I'm clear, if what Commissioner Trigger brought, what we all don't want to say, but is, certainly looming until Tuesday, if we don't know about the sheriff's levy, and the budget assumes a positive result, a passage, we cannot then approve the presented budget until we have definitive answer one way or the other.
Correct, yeah. I'll get more answer for you before Thursday.
Okay.
Or I'll aim for before that. I'll call Department of Revenue and just make sure what is it, yeah. Because ideally you would approve a budget that can go
Well-
on to the board and not have to come back and deal with it and adjust in the meantime, all that kind of stuff, so.
And this committee is making a recommendation to the board.
They are, but the board cannot change what you have
Okay.
recommended for tax levies.
Thank you.
So that's
Yeah,
where we,
okay.
yeah. So
Thank you.
that's where the committee has, we need that decision from you. Yeah, there's certain circumstance, so that's what I want to verify from them, something we've never had to deal
Yeah.
with. So let me verify from them, and sometimes they have to go ask their colleagues what happens in this case.
I'm believing for a positive answer.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
I'm just gonna put
yeah.
that out
So,
there with all this
yes,
little
there we go.
temperature of negativity y'all are spreading on the table.
Thank you for counteracting that, yes.
And if I could check real quick, is the requested tax rate equal to the previous levy amounts? We've had times in the past with the public safety one, where the
Yeah,
sheriff asked for
exactly.
less than.
Right.
Are they all basically at the levy?
It is at the 55 cents per thousand.
Okay, and the same thing for parks?
50 and 5, right?
Yes. The park, since they're planning capital projects and adding staff, they are planning to levy their full amount, and then the OSU Extension Services, their full amount.
Thank you.
Mr. Mukherjee,
Yes, sir.
I'm just kind of putting this out just because of your flavor on it. Do you think maybe now with what I've seen as a real positive response to the levy and all the places that we've stopped and talked, do you think maybe we could have asked for 65 cents?
Oh, I don't know that.
What's your gut telling you on that? Just your
I'm not in a
personal
position
opinion.
to say that.
Yeah,
I think the sheriff who's done 40-plus community meetings
yeah.
is probably in a much better position to be able to say, and I think he answered that question when it came up.
I would say a renewal is easier than an increase.
Yeah,
A renewal is a safer passage than asking for an increase.
Well, I mean, Ryan and I have been on most of those 40 visits, and the response that I've seen, my gut was telling me maybe there was some wiggle room there, but I was just kind of wanting your opinion was.
You were not at the Springfield City Club then, right?
I think that's a good discussion to have on May 17th.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
well, sheriff's gonna be gone.
Sure, is anybody on vacation or something? Yeah.
Okay, do we have anything else?
That was all for the deliberation process. As far as committee business, just reminding everybody about the tour with Pearl and Probation. So if you do decide you want to join that, that's the 17th from 9 to 10 a.m. So I think Jason probably has sent that information out to you, but please let us know. They're over on Highway 99. You know where the building is. So,
And we're back in Harris Hall.
yes, we'll be back in Harris Hall on Thursday. We will have dinner for you. We're ordering mucho gusto. So
And
come ready for
5 o'clock for dinner, 5:30 for
even
the.
before 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Yeah, usually we get the food delivered about 4:30. We want to give plenty of time for people to be able to eat if they want to, yeah.
And we'll be screaming back from County College, is that what we're doing that day?
Okay, any questions from the committee?
Good work. Bravo to move this
Yes.
point.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you all, committee members. We are adjourned.